I'm Romy Drucker. I am the director of the Walton Family Foundation's education program. And I'm very excited to be here and to welcome you to this episode of the After 1954 podcast. Today's episode features several women I feel very lucky to know as inspirational leaders. Aimée Eubanks Davis, Michele Foster, and Nicole Lewis, as well as my colleague Tanya Odom and partner in this work, Liz Thompson. Today's conversation will center on the significance of having educators and mentors who are relatable and who make students feel seen and supported for exactly who they are. Simply starting a conversation about this is incredibly powerful for driving impact. Today's speakers know the power that they can have and that we can all have collectively when we come together to address issues in the field of education using our personal experiences, our skill sets, and storytelling mindsets as tools for impact. Research has shown that having a Black educator improves Black students' academic performance, sense of purpose and belonging in school, and chances of graduating high school and living a self-determined life. The Walton Family Foundation is really honored to help support this amazing work, and I look forward to the perspectives of our expert panel today and learning more about how we can work together to create a more equitable education system. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tanya Odom, Equity and Inclusion Program Director at the Walton Family Foundation and our moderator for today's conversation.
Thank you, Romy, and thank you for your leadership around this. I appreciate it very much. And thank you to the team that sort of brought us all together. So we have a lot of questions and not a lot of time. I'm personally incredibly excited to be here. And I know moderators always say that, I know that. But I have to say, as someone who has an education background, committed to equity, and who believes that we need to keep centering history as a way to talk about things, I really am glad to be here. So I want to just acknowledge the After 1954 podcast series. If you haven't listened to any of the podcasts, I would strongly encourage you to do so. Some of the people that you'll be hearing from today, may have heard them before, but it's worth it, right? Repetition, as we know, helps. So I just want to acknowledge that. So let's jump right in. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, if you can please introduce yourself and talk, this is the brief part of it, right? You all have incredible bios, that's why you're here. But then talk about when was the first time you had a teacher or mentor who looked like you, and what did that mean to you? So Aimée, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Aimée Eubanks Davis, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Braven. And Tanya, when I think about the first teacher mentor who I looked up to, who looked like me, it actually was not my own teacher. It was my sister's Head Start teacher, Joanne Cotton. And we met Joanne at a moment that was a very tender moment for our family, where my father passed away pretty suddenly. And Joanne really took my sister under her wing and took me under her wing. She's my brother's godmother, but really helped guide us and our mom through how to get us situated on the educational front with a loss that was pretty painful in that moment. And just to this day, we're in touch with her. And I just really think about her being such a role model to our family at a time when things were really tough, and she was is a Black woman.
Thank you. Michele, welcome. How would you answer that question?
Hey, well, let me say I didn't have a Black teacher in a formal schooling setting until I was in graduate school. Charles Vert Willy, who just died recently, was a professor of sociology of education, and he was the first Black teacher I ever had. But if I had to speak, I would speak about my grandmother, who I mentioned in the podcast. My grandmother was a dancing school teacher. And so when I was 10 months old, she had been a showgirl in the Black Broadway musicals. I started taking dancing lessons from her. So that would be the first Black teacher I had. And she was the one that made the doll, took the Raggedy Ann doll and made it into a Black doll. So.
Thank you. By the way, Michele, Chuck Willy, Professor Willy was my graduate school advisor. And I still remember to this day how he called every one of us scholars.
Absolutely. And he called us scholars before other people were calling scholars scholars. So.
Exactly. I just got chills. I just needed to tell you that. Oh my goodness. Anyway, Nicole, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Lewis. I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit organization called Generation Hope. And there's a common thread here in that I didn't have my first formal Black teacher like teaching me until I was in 11th grade, my AP history teacher, Mr. Fuller. But I did have just an incredible relationship with a teacher who she wasn't my teacher, but she was the sponsor of our school gospel choir. Her name was Miss Wiley Davis. And I met her because I became involved in the after school gospel choir. And she just was a force to be reckoned with, and just like really dedicated to making sure that we all had this experience. She cared about each and every one of us. There were probably about 30 of us in the choir. And she became a second mom to me, essentially, especially during a time I got pregnant my senior year of high school. So during a time when I really needed as many mamas as I could get in my life. And she became like a grandmother to my daughter. So she was incredibly impactful for me and my family.
Thank you all for that. I have to give credit to Liz Thompson at her first event celebrating the luminaries. They actually asked that question and the chat went on fire, right? Like people thinking about when was the first time. I texted my sister knowing that we would be asking this question. I remember a music teacher, Mrs. Musica, in second grade. But then I said to her, you know, we went to elementary school in a predominantly Black community and we sang, Michele, this you mentioned in your podcast, we sang Lift Every Voice and Sing at every sort of larger event that we did. And so I said to my sister, I don't remember who organized that. And she said, the Black music teacher, Mrs. Washington, right? You know, so I did have that sort of teacher person there. So I just wanted to also give credit to Liz, but just to share my own. So from each of your perspectives, and I think, you know, I mean, you've touched on this in the podcast before, but I think it is important to talk about the legacy. Right. And it's interesting because Brian Stevenson talks about the legacy of slavery, not just being what was done to Black people, enslaved people, but actually the legacy of who we value and don't value and who we think is smart and not smart. Right. So I think there are many legacies we can talk about. But in this moment for this podcast, what's the current legacy of Brown v. Board of Education and then the after Brown v. Board of Education? So I'm going to on that one, I think I'm going to ask each of you, if you can, to weigh in. Michele, can I start with you?
Certainly. I think the legacy of Brown is mixed. Certainly, we needed to desegregate the society. There's no question about that. But I think in the process of doing that, we were throwing, you say, to use a trite term, the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't think people would recognize the extent to which Black teachers lost their jobs until after they were gone. And for a long time, because as W.E. Du Bois said, segregated schools was tied up with the legacy of Black teachers that were confounded, and we didn't honor what they did. I think recently we've had lots of articles, books about schools, about teachers that show the legacy. And when I started writing in the 90s, no one thought anybody about a Black teacher was anybody except a role model. And when the quantitative people got a hold of it, they've been running with it. It's one of the most successful examples of qualitative producing quantitative studies. So I think there's no question anymore. Now, if you had a conversation, you would say, not only are they role models, but they really do have a salutary effect on the achievement. And so it's tragic that we have so few Black teachers. We're not able to recruit them. And part of the problem is that the structures that supported them are gone as well.
Thank you. And I do want to come back, Michele, your work, your research, and your book that talks to Black teachers during that period is so important in this conversation in terms of what can we do moving forward, right? Which we'll talk about at the end, but what's needed. Nicole, I'm going to turn that to you. What would you say is the legacy and how does it continue to impact education today?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree with Michele. I think absolutely it is a mixed legacy. You know, it rejected the concept of separate but equal in public schools, but it also shined a light on the inequities in our American, education system. And we've made advances in some of those inequities since 1954 for sure, but we're still grappling with so many significant disparities, particularly for Black children and Black students. And we haven't even really began to address, the inequities for certain populations of students. The population that we work with every day at Generation Hope is young parents, young mothers and fathers, as well as student parents across the country of any age who are in college. And when we look at things like, only 38% of teen mothers earn a high school diploma. I mean, that is a significant disparity. Fewer than 2% of teen mothers earn a college degree before age 30. We know that these students are more likely to be Black or Latina, for example, when we're looking at teen mothers and single mothers in college. So they're clearly not getting that equal access to information and resources that is critical for them to be successful. And I think the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education, it says that that's what every student needs and deserves to succeed. So I think the decision challenges those of us who are working in education to identify those inequities and to do something to ensure that they're addressed. But for sure, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of road still ahead of us that we have to really be committed to solving these issues on.
Thank you, Nicole. Aimée,
Yeah.
what's your thoughts? I mean, from your organization, but also you've been doing these podcasts and you've been talking to so many different people about this.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, first of all, the podcast, I just have to say, has been incredible from a historical perspective for me, even as a Black educator. I had no idea of the legacy of Brown, just like Michele and Nicole have said, from a very positive standpoint in terms of integration, and also from a very negative standpoint in terms of the long arc of inequality that it actually also brought forth in the Black community. And so in the episode where it talked about the Janes, so they were not just Black teachers who were lost in the most traditional sense. As Michele said, we all want to make sure that we can measure outcomes and measure impact. And then there are these intangibles that are hard to measure in terms of the village effect. And basically the village went away. We basically took away the village. The Janes were a group of educators who went and did not only teaching and learning, but also went into homes and really helped the parents and also helped the young people from a social and emotional standpoint. They were like aunties out there on the road. And I have to say, when I even think about the first Black educator that I mentioned, who was not even my own teacher, she really was that for my family. And just really taking and dismantling the village was such a damning effect long-term on the Black community. I'll also say from another episode, I was just really struck by, actually, Michele, I think this is in your episode, about the 2% of Black educators in higher education. So you think about the K-12 space, yes, but then when you get to Nicole's episode as well, you then start to think about the long arc of that is just simply damaging even into higher ed, where you then don't even have teachers who look like students and who are really encouraging them to get advanced degrees, et cetera. It just really is one of those things that whether you're talking about pre-K or Head Start, all the way through not only college, but graduate school, you basically dismantled the ability for there to be folks who looked like the students that they were teaching or the students that were going to be in those spaces. And what I really fear is that then made young Black people not think about places like college as a place where they belonged or graduate school as a place where they belonged. And then the economic impact of that long term is also very, very damaging. When you think about Black educators really were a part of the serious backbone of the Black middle class, you basically then dismantle the economic underpinnings of the Black community as well. And so I really do hope that as people listen through the series, that they think about all the different parts, not just the teaching and learning piece, but also the dismantling of the village, the dismantling of the economic prospects of an entire community of people, and honestly, the dismantling of the ambition of young people in terms of how high they could go educationally.
Thank you, Aimée. I think it's an important piece to think about, what's that school community? So, there's a wonderful video from several years ago made by a high school student who's now probably, I know she's past college, called A Girl Like Me, where she reenacted the Kenneth Clark doll studies, asking children in New York City who were smart. By the way, I say New York City, just as a person who's living in New York City, where we sometimes think of our enlightened selves because we live in certain places, right? But she asked young children, who were the bad children, who were the smart children, who were like you. And it was the same exact results that we saw Dr. Clark have sort of, and his role in sort of Brown v. Board of Education, right? And proving why this was important. But you just highlighted so many things about why it's not just that teacher. And I think one of the podcasts that I passed around, shared with others, is when you have Morgan, the parent, talking about the assignments in school that are given to children, and there's no one there to say, hey, this is not something that all children can participate in. So Michele, I'd like to start with you on this next question. And, you know, in the podcast, you talk about cultural relevance. And I would hope that in a little piece of this, because I know you talked a little bit about the research about the importance of having Black teachers, Black educators, Black administrators. So I'd love if you can talk a little bit about the connection to special education, standardized tests. What do you think is at the heart of these academic benefits and outcomes of having a Black educator?
Well, one of the things that the literature is very clear now, and it's quantitative stuff. So, you know, we all like the quantitative people. We believe if it has numbers, then it's legit. And so one of the things that we know now is that the greater the number of Black teachers in a school, the less likely children are to be referred to special ed. I'm not against special ed, but some people have argued that, you know, once you get into special ed, you're not getting out. It's not a route out of special ed. You stay there. There's more referrals to gifted and talented programs when you have a Black teacher. You're more likely to graduate from high school and, you know, persist into college if you have a Black teacher. Your Black teachers assess Black children more positively than other teachers do. You're also, so I think there are a lot of benefits. Also, I mean, Dee's study is a great study because it was a gold standard. The Tennessee study, random assignment, you can't get better than that. And what he did find is that Black students who had Black teachers actually scored higher on standardized tests. Now, I'm not, you know, saying that standardized tests are the be all and end all, but it's been very, very difficult and stubborn to move that along. So there's incontrovertible that there are benefits. And another article written by Churn actually talked about the way in which non-Black students liked Black teachers. So I think that that's important to, you know, to understand that it's not just a role model, although role model is important. I gave a talk to the graduate student event at U of L on Friday, and there were Black students, graduate students in the audience. I'm not in the department. It was like a rush to me afterwards. That's how desperate and hungry they are. All right. And so I think that we can't underestimate the effect that just seeing this person who's made it, and that's an idea that you can make it. So I think that's important.
And Michele, I can't remember if it was in your episode where there was also a conversation about the importance of Black teachers helping white teachers who are teaching Black children. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that too, because I think sometimes people get real narrow and it's about Black children. Yes, it is, but it's about all children, as Michele just said, but also about all educators who can learn.
Well, my thought experiment was, suppose instead of firing the Black teachers after Brown, you had taken those teachers and paired them with a white teacher in the classroom. Imagine how that would have been different. I mean, it's easy to do that, you know, in retrospect, but that would have made a huge difference because there would have been some professional development, if you want, and teachers could have seen, how do you deal with the children? How do you interact? But again, you know, that would have been a way to do it. Again, Black teachers knew something about teaching. You know, people say that I think it was Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, talked about whether or not Black people have a culture. And he said, people have created cultures on mountaintops, ice caves. What would make you think that Black people couldn't create a culture on the horns of the white man's dilemma? So I think that this idea that we couldn't do something with limited resources is the part that I think got lost. You know, we had nothing, so we couldn't create anything. And I think that was a way of underestimating what the community was able to do and did do.
So one last thing for you, Michele, if you can, you did mention in the podcast cultural relevance. And I'm just for those educators that are listening, I'm curious if you can just pull that out a bit, because I do think we want to talk about education and standards, et cetera. I think that when we think about the social emotional learning, emotional health, mental stability, all of these things, what's the role of cultural relevance? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, cultural relevance is important. But one of the issues I find when I talk is when I say here's a problem, we're all going to do culturally responsive teaching. And I say to them, what would I see in your classroom if you were doing culturally responsive pedagogy? No one can answer me. So like many things in education, it's a term, it's a buzzword, and it doesn't really say what it is. So cultural relevance to me is a lot of things. It's singing, lift every voice and sing. It's understanding what resources like funds of knowledge the community has. It's all of those things. It's being able to relate kids' experiences to the official curriculum. And so there's been a lot written. Unfortunately, much of it has not been available to teachers. I'm guessing, we academics tend to write to each other. That's a limitation we do. But I wrote an article with some friends in multicultural education, which is about trying to use a heuristic to explain how you would do culturally responsive pedagogy without being prescriptive, because I'm not a person who thinks you give teachers prescriptions, but as a heuristic to understand how you might implement it. So I think that's the problem with many terms, is there's too much talk about it without any real understanding about what it really means in action.
Thank you for that. I remember leading my first program with young people on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I had worked with kids, little kids before that. And my mother, who's been a social worker for years, I called her. I was like, hi, what am I doing, right? Like, this was sort of a program that was to keep kids in school. I'm older than a couple of you, so this was sort of a stay in school program. And my mother said, you know what? Kids know when you care about them, and they know when you want to know about them. And I have to say that was, I've worked with young people for years and years and years. That was one of the learning. I needed to learn about the Lower East Side. I needed to learn about their experiences on the Lower East Side. I needed to learn that they sort of what that meant to them to be in this settlement house program, to see someone like me, right? To know that I wasn't from the community. And I think that to me was one of my best teachers in how to help students stay in school, how to help them stay out of a gang. Like, these were all part of the discourse. And I think I went to the head first. Mom, what should I think about? Like, where? And it wasn't about that totally, right? It was about the heart piece as well. Nicole, I want to come to you. I mean, you talked a little bit about your organization and what you do, but when we talk about the incredible talent of Black students, keeping students in school, allowing students to be successful, what do you think the key supports are, and how can we increase access to them?
Yeah, so I think, key supports, if we could have an umbrella term, it's holistic. There is not one thing that is going to be a magic wand. I think when we think about what students really need to be successful and what we believe and what we kind of live out every day at Generation Hope, it's this holistic model. And that includes emotional supports, financial supports, and access to social capital. Those things are critical for young people to succeed, for all young people. But when we think about Black students in particular, and the ways that they've been cut off from those resources, it's incredibly important that we surround them with these things if we want them to be successful. And it can't just be academic supports, not that those aren't important. And at Generation Hope, we certainly, all of our students are young parents. They are at 2- and 4-year schools. They definitely need support in choosing classes and proofreading English papers and deciding what their major should be, and kind of having a sense of how long will it take for me to graduate if I continue at a part-time status versus a full-time status. Those are definitely things that we work with our students on. But we know that, most of the derailments that happen for our students happen outside of the classroom. It's not because they can't quite grasp a concept, that a professor is trying to teach, or really even that they're having a hard time on a particular test. Not that those don't happen, and we have a whole tutoring program that can help them in those situations. But for the most part, when it comes to, can I stay in college? Can I stay the course? Those derailments are usually life things. Those are, I'm going to be evicted from my home at the end of the month. I've had a domestic violence situation with my partner. It is, I can't afford childcare anymore. And if I can't afford childcare, I can't go to school. I lost my job. I'm working 3 jobs and going to school. I need to find a way to be able to move to one job that pays better so I can better, have more time to be able to devote to my studies and to parenting. These are the things that we are finding most of our coaching and our work with our students is really about. And so that's why it's critical that as we think about what are those key supports and resources, we have to think about them more broadly than just kind of the traditional sense of what happens in the classroom. Those are all important pieces of the puzzle, but I think we don't talk enough about the other parts of that. And I even think within COVID-19, We've seen the importance of mental health. You know, that was not a topic as we were talking about what students need to thrive. That was at the top of the list really prior to COVID-19. But I think the public and most people have become acutely aware of how the pandemic has impacted students' mental health and the fact that there need to be more mental health supports in our education spaces to ensure that they're able to focus on academics. They're able to continue on, whether it's in high school, whether it's in college. So all of these things are really important. And I think, you know, we see that play out each and every day. I think increasing access to them is going to require investments. It's going to require looking at, you know, resources and saying, how do we allocate more resources to mental health supports, to making sure that we have mentoring programs, to making sure that we have after school opportunities, or at the college level, looking at the financial hurdles that exist for young people and students to be able to access a post-secondary credential. They're significant, and we're seeing within the pandemic that college enrollment is declining, and particularly for Black students. And definitely we know for parenting college students, the nearly 5 million parenting college students across the country, they are more likely to have considered dropping out or stopping out of college within the pandemic than other students. So these are the things that we have to really look at and think about, and not narrowly kind of look at the key supports that are going to help our students make it through, but broaden our purview and think about this in a more holistic sense.
Great. Aimée, Michele, would you like to add anything to that in terms of the supports and how we might sort of work to increase access to them?
Yeah, I will just comment from the lens of the organization I run, Braven. So like Nicole, we work in the world of higher education, and I just want to double click on what she said about often when we see a young person start to come off of the path to completion, it almost has nothing to do with the academic part. It is all about food insecurity, housing insecurity, other factors outside of the actual classroom that come and start to get into the way. And so one of the things that, you know, my organization really helps young people who are first in their families to go to college on the Pell Grant, come out of college and earn an entire dollar instead of 66 cents on the dollar. And one of the big things that I continue to wonder about is actually the role of work study and how we might think about reimagining work study for young people who have so many demands on their time, whether that's because they're parenting or also they're sometimes parenting on the other end when it comes to caregiving for other family members that might not actually be their biological children. And so really trying to think through how we could think about work study in a way that is not like the work study that I did, which was doing the dishes or sitting at the library desk at my college, but are there other ways in which young people in college can go ahead and get their work study money, but it not be quite as boxed in as it is today? Because definitely from an economic standpoint, that's what we continue to see, is that it's just really hard to concentrate on your studies and to get your studies done when you have all these other factors at play.
Right, and I want to add something. There's recently been legislation, I think in Colorado and other places, where, you know, they don't pay teachers to do student teaching. So if you are a Black person, you want to do student teaching, that's free. And so Colorado, I just read that this morning, is actually trying to change that. And I know the same thing is going on in Kentucky, that this is work. And if I have to have another job to be a student teacher, then, you know, so that's a good example of one thing that could change quickly. And I also think it's also helping students. The students I see are doing well academically, but they run into problems when they have a situation that they can't deal with. Let's say a counselor gives them bad advice. I had yesterday, one of my friends called me to say that one of the students at U of L had gotten a very negative feedback from her counselor about becoming a teacher, and told, well, you should just wait till next year. And that's not the right answer. That's the wrong answer. So I'm going to have to intervene next week with that. But I'm just saying, you know, so her response is to just walk away and not go back. And so so those are also the kinds of things. And they're not academic. The student is doing well. She's passing the praxis. But it's this kind of discouraging her when we should not be discouraging young Black people who want to be teachers. That's the wrong message.
I just want to double click on that, Michele. I did student teach. I earned my English degree and my post-secondary teaching certification while I was in college as a teen mom, working my way through college as a single mother. And I student taught my junior and my senior year. And it was so difficult because I was, putting myself through college. That was hard enough as a mom. And then I was student teaching, which was like a full-time job, and I wasn't getting paid for it.
You were doing it for
free. Yes. And I was like having to get there at like 6:45 in the morning. It was crazy. So kudos, Colorado.
And that's a simple fix. I don't think that's difficult to fix, but I think that but no one's really thought about it. How is that discouraging people from being teachers? And so that's something that every state could do tomorrow if they really wanted to.
Absolutely. Let's hope that happens.
Maybe if they're watching this webinar, they might listen and do it. We can
actually, you can tell you're working with brilliant women because you already entered the next set of questions, right? No, I mean, it's true. So I don't have to prod or post or nudge, but I do want to start to pick up on this a little bit, this notion of a couple of things. One is COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19, right? Which we touched on a little bit. But really sort of the US shortage of teachers around the country, right? So then if we take sort of this conversation, knowing that we have fewer teachers of color and fewer Black teachers to begin with, and now we're talking about a shortage. So curious to hear your thoughts, each of you or whoever wants to begin. What can we do? What can we be thinking about differently? Obviously, Michele, paying people, right?
Right.
I also think about being a graduate school student. I went to a graduate school of education, and because I had Professor Willy, Michele, Dr. Willy, a lot of my work was independent study, meaning my research wasn't in the curriculum that was there. So he and I were creating things that I could study about, which connected to inequity in education outside of what was being given in coursework, right? Because I had someone who believed in me, but also who knew how important that was. So I want to just flag sort of curriculum, right? What we're teaching people. And I think, Michele, you spoke to this in the podcast with Aimée as well, but curious to hear from you all. What are some things we can do specifically in addressing this US teacher shortage?
So I want to be careful because I might be creating a spoiler alert. So I'm only going to talk about the person by her first name, but there is an episode where a woman named Kimberly, who's a teacher in Louisiana, really talks about how she wants to see more of her students consider teaching. And she teaches in a predominantly Black school. And so she set up this whole program where they are going through learning about being an educator through the lens of social justice, which I thought was just really brilliant, because I do think as long as in this country, we do not view and value teachers at the same level as we do other professions, that then young people don't believe that that is a true profession, not only that they can pursue and hopefully not get knocked off the track like we were hearing Michele talk about earlier, but also where they view it as a stature and a status symbol of greatness. And truly, Michele's podcast, I will just never forget the line, "It is a sin to waste Black talent." That is so true. It is so true. And I think the moment that Black and brown talent don't see themselves as going into teaching as a profession, we are really in trouble, because then it does not create a strong pipeline. And so the pipeline has to start, I would argue, earlier, where young people really see teaching as a true profession that they can get into and make a huge impact on not only the students they teach, but I would argue our broader society.
One place that's being done, actually, I'm on the board of, I guess, directors. I think that's what it's, some kind of a board for a school that's in San Antonio. San Antonio has a lot of career schools. They have STEM, and then they're creating in the fall Cast Teach. It's going to be a high school which focuses on the professions. And one of the people that's involved was a graduate student of mine. So that's how I got involved. There were schools like that in the past. And so that's a good way. It's a magnet school of sorts that students choose. And the whole focus as we develop the curriculum is how to teach in a way that we would hope the teachers, those young people would teach when they became teachers. Having them imagine the teachers that they didn't have in San Antonio. I mean, one of the reasons a lot of Black and brown students don't want to become teachers is because Oh, they didn't like their teachers, but having them think about, you could be the teacher you didn't have, I think is really important. You know, you can be that person. So I think that those kinds of programs, the other program they used to have, this is a long time ago, is they had programs that the federal government funded where they actually went and they took teacher aides. And they were people in California who spoke Vietnamese, or they spoke Chinese, or they lived in the community. They weren't moving. They had been there 15 years. They're not moving to, Wisconsin. And they had relationships with the kids, and they made it possible for them to be a pathway into teaching. So that's another source that we underestimate, right? And I think we have to be a little bit more creative than we've been.
Yeah, Michele is right. In this same Kimberly episode, she also works with basically it's a college that grants degrees and helps people who are bus drivers, or they might be cafeteria workers, but they are people who live in the South Louisiana community, get credentials to be a teacher, and they've been in the school buildings often for years,
Right.
And really could be a source of another pipeline.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I don't want to speed bump over the compensation piece of this, because I'll take it back to my own experience. So I mentioned that I got my teaching certification when I graduated from college. And I actually had a job offer to work in a school system. I was living in the DC region, and I had a job offer to work for Fairfax County Public Schools. And I think people know in the DC region, the cost of living is just ridiculously high. Here I was, a single mom, a young mom, just graduated from college. I couldn't take that teaching position and pay for childcare and pay for an apartment to live in that area. And so that's one of the reasons that I didn't become a teacher, and probably the most significant reason. So when we think about the compensation piece, I think we can't speed bump over that. We really have to name that in this, because it's incredibly important. The other thing, and I think this is definitely in light of COVID-19, and I know, that was one of the things that we elevated in this question. What I think I've heard loud and clear from people, from educators, whether it is at the K through 12 or higher education level, and Black educators in particular, is feeling like they have not been listened to, and feeling like they have been really forced into decisions, and forced into situations, and have not had a seat around the table in decision making. And I think when we think about schools reopening, mask mandates, the vaccination debates, like all of these different things, remote learning, just really feeling like they have not been valued, that their perspectives have not been a part of these conversations and allowed to be a part of these conversations. And that is something that I think really does need to change. If we're going to work to have more Black teachers coming into classrooms, coming into this profession, we have to be a space. These education spaces have to be a place where they feel like their voice matters, where they feel like they have a seat around the table, that they can influence decisions. And that was already not happening enough prior to COVID-19, but certainly within the pandemic, that has been something that we've heard loud and clear. And we have students in our program at Generation Hope who are on the path to become teachers, who are, wanting to be early educators, wanting to work in the K through 12 space, and seeing what was happening during COVID-19 for teachers gave them pause, many of them, about, is this the right profession when if I don't feel safe, going into a classroom when there's a pandemic happening, or, when there are these decisions being made and my voice isn't going to matter around the table, is this the right profession for me? So I do think that's something that we really have to name, that there are some norms within our education system that are not set up to validate Black teachers, to value them, and to give them a voice. And that has to be addressed if we want to make this a profession that is really welcoming and supportive of these professionals.
You all are giving me like 20 more questions that I would really love to ask you all. We don't have time. So but I do want to just go back to this that we've touched on. So Nicole, I think what you just said is a really good leverage point. can we talk a little bit more about what teacher prep programs can do, about what graduate schools of education can do, about what leaders can do, right? Black leaders, leaders who are not of color, right? Like, I just want to hear a little bit more for those people who might be listening. So teacher prep programs, graduate school of ed programs, leaders, what are some thoughts on that? Michele, can I start with you?
Well, I think one of the things that stubbornly has not changed, despite, let's say, the Holmes Scholar Program, which seeks to recruit people into PhD programs in education, is the fact that many or most of the people that do teacher ed are white faculty. Okay, that is the case. And the curriculum still is too centered in what I call a cultural deficit model. You know, although there's been lots written, you know, I said in the podcast, when I went to the Blossom Up schools and they said the kids were culturally deprived, I thought the people were insane. I said, these people are insane. What are they talking about? But that's from the 60s and that still persists. And this idea that children don't have any assets. And so you see teachers in schools of teacher education being taught to teach to the weaknesses. And that still has not changed from when I was a teacher. Right? I should say I wasn't a teacher because Boston didn't hire me. I started teaching before DSEG, so they didn't hire me. That's why I'm not a teacher today. But I think it's important to say that that really hasn't changed. I have a student who's writing a paper about syllabi, and it's about how there's all this talk about anti-racism, but there's no action. It's just talk. Every syllabus has a statement. We are anti-racist, you know, blah, blah, blah. But it's performative. And so you've really got to get down in there and do that. And that has been stubbornly resistant to change. There's been a lot of discussion about it, but there hasn't been the kind of change that we really need to do. So that is one thing that needs to happen. And you need to have, and I'll just use my university. I came up with the heuristic. It was a presentation that I did with 2 graduate students and a faculty member. We presented it at NAME, National Association of Multicultural Education. I'm just going to say this because I'm not afraid to say anything. I gave it to my dean. I gave it to the person in charge of the program. They didn't even read it and get back to me. Now it's being used with other places. So what can I say? I'm here. I know some things. I think people think I know some things, but the people at my university don't think I know anything. So if you're not going to take advantage of what people who are there, who have some reputation know, then there's no hope. And that, I think, is what the stubborn resistance is. I'm sure that's not just my situation. I'm sure that's a lot of different places.
Thank you for that. You know, I think when you were talking, one of my mentors and teachers, formally and informally, is Mel King, who civil rights leader in Boston. And, you know, I've been interviewing him for years, just personally, right? And he's the one I call when something happens in our country that I'm trying to figure out. He's the one I call when I experience some of these workplace issues. And he always stops me or anybody around from calling students poor children. He's like, poor in what? Like he has done this for me for years since I met him in the 90s. And he's changed the focus. And he talks about how we refer to students alone dictates how we're thinking about students, right? I mean, I don't know if you were coming off of mute. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of these teacher prep programs, grad school? And I really want to touch on leaders, because I believe, because I've been forwarding the podcast to a lot of people, and I know everyone listening is hopefully going to forward these podcasts to a lot of people. So to those leaders listening, what are your thoughts? What advice, coaching, some thoughts that you might have around that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say is how important I actually think from the leader standpoint it is to nurture your talent in your buildings, and not only recruit the talent, but when you think about what's happened, you have a lot of teachers in general and Black teachers, it's what Nicole was talking about, who have left the profession prematurely because they are just burnt out and tired and feel like there's no voice in it for them, etc. I'm actually going to shift just a little bit to talk about the importance I actually think of this new program out there on TV called Abbott Elementary. I actually think Abbott Elementary is so important in terms of allowing people to see the joy in a pretty much an all Black school, the excellence of the veteran teacher, right? The eagerness of the new teacher, like to see the humanity in it all and the excellence that can come out and the quirkiness, right, of the principal and all the other people, right? It is what it is. But I actually think the media has not done a strong enough job of ensuring that people could see themselves as educators, but also this, lifting up Black educators in the way that this program is doing, I think is so important. And this is, one thing just in watching that series that I've thought a lot about in my own, starting out as a classroom teacher, 6th grade, Brenda Benoit was my mentor teacher. And she was like the reason I survived those first initial couple years, and then decided to stay in the profession. I mean, I just adored her. I adored Tony Ricasner, who was my principal. I just thought the world of these people, and it's why I stayed in the profession. But when you think about the veteran teacher and the veteran Black teacher, honestly, they can do a master class in their classroom for educators in schools of education. And honestly, it could be another way of helping on the compensation side as well. I just feel like we are not being creative enough and innovative enough about how do we work with the talent that's in the building to honestly elevate them in general, but also from a pay standpoint, but where young people can have real experiences in those sorts of classrooms, and really honestly fall in love with the profession. Because that's what happened for me. I mean, my parents literally had a conniption fit when I was like, I'm going to go into education. They were like, what are you doing? Right? We've spent all this money on this education and this is what you're going to do. And I was like, yeah. But my older sister became an attorney. Every time I went to visit her in her law offices, I was like, there are no children on these walls. Like, there's no joy in this whole thing for me. And I figured out how to make it work as a profession that I've absolutely fallen in love and stayed in. And I just think we really got to think creatively about how do we get folks to really experience the joy of excellence in Black classrooms.
And one of the things I did, actually, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I had a grant from the Department of Education, OERI, before it was IES, used to be Office of Education Research and Improvement. I got a whole ton of money, $1.3 million. I created after-school programs. I hired those veteran teachers. It was called Learning Through Teaching in an After-School Pedagogical Laboratory. I hired veteran teachers in Trenton, in LA, in San Diego, in Oakland, and I had them have an after-school program for kids, and I took the young teachers and I had them sit and watch them teach their kids. We gave them graduate credit. They stayed and they watched 2 hours, and my idea was, even if the teachers don't get better, the kids will have 3 kids of after school. We had tremendous success. Of course, I was running it. So I was also a faculty member. So keeping that going, but and we paid the teachers. That's a way to do it. And so you're giving, it's helping the children. It's helping we invited parents to come and visit, and we said, this is the kind of teacher your child should have. We got the parents interested. There are all kinds of things like that we could do. But, I did it on a grant.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you brought up so many different things. I mean, I think one of the things as I sort of get ready to turn this over to Liz Thompson, who we have a short video from her, who's one of the hosts of this, I think you're really asking us all to think about many different things. One is, I think, centering history, sort of what we learned, what's different, what's changed, right? I think you're also, all of you have sort of highlighted, and I appreciated, not shied away from naming the inequity, naming what is not right that needs to be fixed, because until we do that, right, we can't fix what we don't name. We can't identify what needs to work. You also brought up innovation, and I know sort of the education team at the foundation works a lot on looking at innovative models. And I think, so does Liz Thompson and her foundation. So I think that's really important. So I'm gonna take a couple of minutes because we started a minute late. So a couple of minutes late before I turn it over to Liz. Any last thoughts from all of you? One, I hope people listen to the podcast and look you all up. As the moderator, I spent a lot of time listening to all of you before we got here, and I feel like I know you, but I learned some things, right? I think that whole notion of how we learn has changed. So I appreciate what you all have contributed to my learning, and I would offer others who are out there wanting to learn more to not only Google you all, but look at the videos, listen to the podcast, read some of Michele's work, read Michele's book, which to me highlights and uplifts voices that we don't always hear about. And Michele, I almost selfishly want to do a whole other podcast with you on that. So I'm thinking about something. So stay tuned. But last thoughts for all of you, calls to action, things you're thinking about. How can we address this moving forward? How do we think about the legacy and think about what we can do differently? Any thoughts?
Let's just try some innovative stuff. That's my thing. We have things that people have done. We should try and do more of that.
I was just going to say something very similar, Michele, is just I think, number one, I would say ask Black teachers.
Absolutely.
They are the experts. Something that we believe wholeheartedly at Generation Hope is our students are the first people we go to when we're trying to solve a problem. That doesn't happen enough. And it certainly isn't happening for Black students and for Black teachers. So if you're looking for solutions to these problems, to these issues, how do we advance this work? How do we honor the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education? Ask your teachers and they will tell you. They have the solutions. They have the innovative ideas. And then lastly, I think be willing to uproot the system, be willing to challenge the norms and to innovate and do things totally differently than the way that they've been done. That's how we're going to move forward and see real progress.
Yeah, the only thing that I would end with is this whole point about excellence. Excellence is in action. We have to make sure that we're being action oriented towards making sure that we're really addressing, which was a huge inequity, like I said early on, across the spectrum, not only from teaching and learning in terms of Black children. 38,000 teachers got fired, straight up fired and that's just in the South. We're not even talking about the North and the East and the West, because it really was a ripple impact across the country. But really thinking about how do we then flood the pipelines again, to Michele and to Nicole's point, with innovation that brings in that level and honestly above that over time, number of Black teachers back into the system, as well as other teachers who identify as teachers of color. And the good that does for everyone, including white teachers, white children, and honestly for the country. The country actually needs Black children to succeed on an exponential level. Otherwise, we are in trouble as we're needing to compete across the world. And so I'll end with finally from, I think, Michele, this is your grandfather's term, it is a sin to waste Black talent. And we have to take this on in a really mighty way to ensure all of us have the lives that we hope for this country over time.
Thank you, Aimée. I think listening to the podcast with the student Aaliyah, as I said to you in an email message, like that alone brings up exactly what you're talking about, the wisdom of children and young people who are living a life in our schools, right? In our schools, and have some thoughts about that.